So here's the thing, Vera, my wife of 19 years, has never been the type to get too bent out of shape over my work schedule. She knew from day one that my job demanded a lot of time, and she'd always been supportive. But lately, things felt off. Real off. It all started a couple of months ago when Vera's best friend Carol announced her wedding date. Carol was finally getting hitched, and Vera was buzzing with excitement about it. She started talking non-stop about the wedding, the dress she'd picked, how she'd be Carol's maid of honor. I remember thinking, great, she's happy. This is good. But then my boss dropped a bomb, an important meeting scheduled on the exact weekend of Carol's wedding. And this wasn't any ordinary meeting. It was the kind of high-stakes deal that could make or break my promotion. Missing it wasn't an option. When I broke the news to Vera, her whole demeanor changed. She looked at me like I'd just told her I was moving to Mars. "You're really not coming?" she asked, with that cold edge I hadn't heard before. I tried to explain. "Look, Vera, I don't want to miss it. But you know how big this deal is. If I can secure it, we're set. No more crazy hours, more time together. It's for us too." She didn't look convinced. In fact, she looked distant, like she was already a million miles away. "Fine," she said, but it was anything but fine. She barely spoke to me in the days leading up to the wedding, just kept herself busy with wedding preparations and Carol. I'll be honest, leaving Vera to go to that meeting felt like walking into a storm. She barely said goodbye, just kind of nodded when I told her I'd make it up to her somehow. And yeah, I knew she was disappointed, but I thought we'd get over it. She knew how much I'd been pushing for this promotion. 19 years of marriage, and she'd always been right there, understanding every late night, every trip, every sacrifice I had to make. But that morning, there was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just disappointment. It was like she was already checked out. I tried to shake it off and focus on the meeting, but the whole drive there, my mind was stuck on Vera. I kept telling myself I'd explain it better when I got back, maybe take her somewhere special to make it up. And then, just as I was about to walk into the meeting room, my phone buzzed with a text. "Meeting cancelled. Rescheduled for next week." I could barely process it. I'd spent weeks preparing, and they just cancelled? Frustration hit me first, but then it turned into something else, relief. Because right there, it hit me, this was my chance. A chance to turn things around with Vera, to show her I wasn't choosing work over her, not this time. Within minutes, I was on the phone, booking the first flight back to town. Every second I spent at the airport felt like an eternity. I thought about texting her to let her know, but I wanted to keep it a surprise. I picture her shock when I showed up at the reception, how her face would light up when she realized I'd dropped everything just to be with her. The plane ride felt like it was crawling. I kept replaying the past few months in my head, wondering when things had started to feel different. Sure, we'd both been busy, but it felt like she'd put this wall up. Maybe she felt I was always wrapped up in my career, that I wasn't paying enough attention to her or the family. Maybe I hadn't been around as much as I should have been. This was my shot to fix that, to make things right. I promised myself that when I showed up, I'd make it clear, nothing, not even work, meant more to me than her. When I finally landed, I could barely wait to get to the venue. Carol's wedding was a big deal, so it wasn't hard to find the location, but I still parked in the back, not wanting anyone to see me just yet. The place was buzzing, music spilling out of the doors, laughter filling the air. As I made my way inside, I caught glimpses of guests, everyone looking relaxed and in the moment. I thought of how Vera must be there somewhere, caught up in the fun of it all, probably a glass of wine in hand, laughing with her friends. And then I spotted her. There she was, right in the middle of the dance floor, all dressed up, looking beautiful. But something was wrong. My eyes zeroed in on the man next to her, his hand on her waist, leaning in too close. It was Clayton. Of all people, her ex-husband. The one she'd barely mentioned in years. He was standing so close it made my blood run cold. She was laughing at something he said, tilting her head back in that familiar way that used to be just for me. It didn't look innocent. It looked like she was comfortable with him, like she belonged there in his arms. I felt sick watching it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then, as if to drive the final nail into the coffin, she leaned in and kissed him. Right there, in the middle of the crowd, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't believe it. My whole world cracked in that instant. Everything we'd built, every moment we'd shared, it all seemed to shatter right there on that dance floor. I felt numb, like I was watching this all happen to someone else, some other poor fool who trusted his wife with everything he had. My hand was shaking as I took out my phone and snapped a picture. I didn't even know why I did it. Maybe I just needed something to convince myself that this wasn't just some horrible nightmare. I took a deep breath and typed out a single message, attached the picture, and hit send. I saw you. I waited just long enough to see her pull out her phone, watch her face fall as she read my text. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with shock, scanning the crowd like she thought she'd see me there. But I was already walking away. I couldn't bear to see whatever came next, whatever excuses she'd come up with to try to explain what I'd just seen. I got in my car and drove. The whole way home, my mind was racing with a million questions, a million things I wanted to say, but one thought kept pushing everything else out. How long? How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied straight to my face, pretended everything was fine while sneaking around with him? By the time I pulled into our driveway, I felt like I'd gone through every emotion under the sun. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. Mostly though, there was this empty feeling, like someone had hollowed me out and left nothing but the shell. The woman I'd loved, trusted, and built a life with, she was a stranger now. I walked inside, sat down at the dining room table, and poured myself a drink. Then another. And then I picked up my laptop, opened our financial records, and started dividing everything we owned. I wasn't going to wait for her explanations, her excuses. I'd spent my whole life living by my father's words, the ones he drilled into me from as far back as I could remember: never tolerate disrespect. And what Vera had done, there was no coming back from that. 4 hours, I worked in silence, marking down who would get what, deciding what we'd sell. Every time my phone buzzed with a call or text from her, I ignored it. She'd made her choice. Now, I was making mine. There she was, right in the middle of the dance floor, looking beautiful as ever. I almost called out to her, but something stopped me cold. She wasn't alone. Clayton was right beside her. Clayton, her ex-husband. He had one hand resting on her waist, and he was leaning in close. Way too close. My heart sank as I took in the scene, feeling my stomach twist with a gut-wrenching sense of betrayal. I told myself to wait, that maybe I was overreacting, that it was just a dance, and it didn't mean anything. But then I saw it, the look on her face. She was smiling, laughing at something he said, like they were sharing some kind of inside joke. She looked at him the way she hadn't looked at me in a long time. And then, before I even had time to process it, she leaned in and kissed him. Just a quick kiss, but it was enough. Enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She didn't look shocked or pull away, didn't push him back. She just let it happen. My whole world cracked open right there on that dance floor. My wife, the woman I'd trusted with everything, was kissing her ex-husband in front of everyone like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my hand tremble as I took out my phone, snapped a quick picture, and typed out a single message: I saw you. I sent it before I could change my mind and walked out. The last thing I wanted was to see her face when she read it, to watch her scramble for an explanation I didn't need to hear. The only thing I knew for sure as I walked out of that reception hall was that my marriage was over. As I walked out of that reception hall, my mind was reeling. It was like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My hands shook, my chest felt tight. Everything I thought I knew about Vera, about our life together, had just shattered in front of me. She'd kissed him, Clayton. The one person she'd promised was firmly in her past. I walked to my car, sat behind the wheel, and just stared at the dashboard. I couldn't go home. Not yet. The idea of stepping back into the house we shared, where everything would remind me of her, was too much to bear. I just sat there in the silence, replaying the scene over and over. A dozen memories flashed through my mind, times when I thought we were happy, times when I felt lucky to have her by my side. I thought about the late nights, the long hours, all the sacrifices I'd made to give us a good life. I'd given everything to build our family, our home, and for what? To find her with him, like none of it meant anything? I glanced down at my phone, half expecting to see a flood of messages from her. But there was nothing. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. Maybe she was still reeling from my message. Maybe she hadn't even noticed I was gone yet. My mind went into overdrive, questions flooding in, one after another. Had this been going on for months? Had she been seeing him behind my back? And if so, how had I missed it? Had I been so focused on work, so blinded by trust, that I didn't see what was right in front of me? After a few minutes, my anger shifted to something colder, harder. My father's voice came back to me, the words he drilled into me since I was a kid. Never let anyone disrespect you, son. Not even once. He'd always been a hard man, and maybe I'd resented him for that sometimes. But right now, I understood him perfectly. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and opened my laptop. There was no way I was going to sit around and let her explain this away as a mistake. I logged into our financial accounts, pulled up our assets, and started dividing everything. I didn't know what this would mean for the future, but one thing was crystal clear: Vera wasn't going to be a part of it. An hour later, my phone finally buzzed. It was Vera calling, probably desperate to talk, to explain, to spin some excuse about what I'd just seen. I let it ring. Then another call. And another. Finally, she switched to texts. Please call me. I can explain. It's not what you think. Just talk to me. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the words, trying to stay focused. Every time I started to feel even a flicker of doubt, that image came back, her and Clayton, wrapped up in each other, like they were the ones who had built this life together, like I was just some outsider in my own marriage. I knew I had to leave to put some space between us, so I packed a bag enough for a few days, and booked a room at the company condo. I wasn't going to let her twist this around, to pull me back with her promises and apologies. No, this time I was done. As I walked out of the house, I glanced back one last time, taking in the familiar walls, the photos of us and the girls, the life we'd built together. It felt distant, like a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. I shut the door, feeling the finality of it, and left without a backward glance. When I got to the condo, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of relief that the decision was already made. I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch, and stared at the city lights through the window. Somewhere out there, Vera was dealing with the fallout of her choices, but I didn't care anymore. By the time the sun rose, I knew one thing for sure: my life with Vera was over, and there was no turning back. I spent the night at the condo, but there was no sleep, just hours of sitting there, staring into the dark, trying to come to grips with what had happened. By morning, I'd made up my mind. This wasn't going to be one of those dragged-out separations where people take a break and pretend everything will work itself out. Vera had crossed a line, and there was no going back. When I got home, the house was still quiet. Vera must have come back at some point because her purse was on the kitchen counter, and a single light was on in the living room. I heard movement upstairs, and then there she was, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. She'd clearly been crying, her face blotchy, eyes swollen, but I felt nothing seeing her like that. I was too drained for sympathy, too angry for forgiveness. "Tony," she started, her voice raw, like she'd been rehearsing what to say. But I wasn't interested in a conversation. "Check your email," I said, my voice colder than I intended. Her face scrunched up in confusion. "What?" "Check your email," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything's there. I've split up our accounts, listed our assets, and outlined what I think is fair. You'll get the house. I'll take the condo and keep our investments. That should be enough to get this done fast." Her face paled as she realized what I was saying. She shook her head, almost like she was trying to will this away. "Tony, please. Can't we talk about this? It was a mistake, okay? A horrible, stupid mistake, but I swear, it didn't mean anything. I was drunk, he was just there, and—" "Stop," I said, cutting her off, my voice firmer now. "Don't try to explain this away, Vera. I saw everything I needed to see. There's no coming back from this." She took a step toward me, her hand outstretched, her voice breaking. "Tony, please, we've been together for so long. This can't be how it ends." I shook my head, forcing myself to stay calm. "You ended it the second you decided to let him back into your life. You think I don't see it? You've been distant for months. I thought it was stress, maybe something with the kids or your job. But now I know what it was. You chose him." She started to cry harder, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't choose him. I was just confused, okay? It was just one night. It meant nothing. Then why did you kiss him like it did?" The words came out sharper than I intended, and I could see the impact hit her. "You didn't look confused to me, Vera. You looked happy." Her sobbing turned desperate, and she stepped closer, reaching for me again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you, Tony. Please. I love you." I swallowed hard, steadying myself. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have humiliated me in front of everyone. You wouldn't have put our family on the line. You've been lying to me for months, and I can't live with that." She stood there, crushed, but I was done. I grabbed the bag I'd left by the door, took one last look at her, and turned to leave. Her voice, broken and desperate, followed me as I stepped outside. "Tony, please don't go. Don't just leave like this." I paused at the door, holding myself steady. "I'll be in touch. For now, I need some space. Take some time to think about what you've done." With that, I walked out, not looking back. The door shut behind me, a heavy finality settling over me. I was done, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into work, into being there for my daughters, into rebuilding my life. The house was just a place I'd visit on weekends to see the girls, who decided to stay with me more often than with their mom. They didn't know all the details, of course, but they knew enough to side with me. Vera tried to keep reaching out, sending texts and emails, even leaving voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. She said she wanted to explain, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she still loved me. But I didn't listen to a single one. I didn't need to. There was nothing she could say that would undo the damage. Every time her name popped up on my screen, it was a fresh reminder of her betrayal, and I refused to go down that road again. At work, things were finally starting to look up. That cancelled meeting? I ended up closing the deal and getting the promotion I'd been gunning for. I spent long hours at the office, partly out of necessity and partly to keep myself busy. My team started noticing a change in me, maybe the way I was pushing harder, taking on more responsibility, as if trying to make up for everything that had gone wrong in my personal life. The truth was, work became my escape. The more I threw myself into it, the less time I had to think about her, about the life we'd had that was now gone. And then, not long after, Cheryl entered my life. She was new to the company, brought in to help with some of the major projects I was handling. We'd been introduced in a meeting, just another handshake, another face. But there was something different about her. She was calm, grounded, the kind of person who had a quiet strength about her. She was good at her job, efficient and sharp, but also kind in a way that I hadn't seen in a long time. Cheryl had this warmth that felt genuine, unguarded. We started talking more as we worked late nights together, sharing little bits about our lives. She knew I was going through a separation but never pushed for details. Instead, she just listened, sometimes offering a quiet word of support, sometimes just letting the silence settle between us in a way that felt comfortable. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I suggested we grab a coffee before heading home. We sat in a quiet little cafe, and for the first time, I opened up about what had happened with Vera. Cheryl didn't judge, didn't ask intrusive questions. She just listened, nodding as I poured out the story of a marriage that had ended in betrayal. And when I finally stopped talking, she looked at me with this gentle understanding in her eyes and simply said, "You deserve better than that." Hearing those words from someone who barely knew me, someone who hadn't seen the years of good times and hard work I'd put into that marriage, hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It was like she saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Slowly, things started to shift. Cheryl and I grew closer, spending more time together both in and out of the office. She brought a peace into my life that I hadn't felt in years, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. We took things slow, careful not to rush into anything, but over time, I realized that she was someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't pull the rug out from under me. My daughters took to her faster than I'd expected, which was a relief. Cheryl wasn't the type to push her way into our lives, but she treated them with kindness and respect. She listened to them, joked with them, made them feel seen in a way that even Vera hadn't managed in a long time. And as I watched them warm up to her, I felt a glimmer of hope, something I hadn't let myself feel in months. Meanwhile, Vera's world was falling apart. Word traveled fast, especially in our tight-knit community. People had caught wind of what happened between Vera and me, and sympathy wasn't on her side. The friends she'd once counted on slowly started distancing themselves. The people who'd once invited her to dinners, outings, and weekend get-togethers were no longer reaching out. Carol, her best friend, the one whose wedding night Vera had turned into a spectacle, was one of the first to pull back. I heard through mutual friends that Carol was embarrassed, maybe even furious, that her wedding had become the setting for such a scandal. It didn't take long for Vera's social circle to shrink to nearly nothing. The few friends she had left didn't want to be seen with her publicly, didn't want their names wrapped up in the gossip and whispers that now followed her everywhere. What had once been a full, lively life was quickly turning into isolation, and from what I heard, she was struggling to deal with it. Meanwhile, things with Clayton, the man she'd risked everything for, were already falling apart. Their relationship, if it could even be called that, was doomed from the start. Whatever spark had driven them back into each other's arms that night had burned out quickly in the light of real life. Vera's attempts to find comfort in him didn't last. They fought constantly, their arguments only reminding them of why they'd broken up in the first place. It didn't take long for him to disappear from her life, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her choices. From time to time, I'd hear from mutual acquaintances that she was asking about me, trying to reach out indirectly. She'd mention how she wished things had gone differently, how much she regretted what she'd done. But every time I heard those words, they only felt hollow. She'd made her choice, and she'd chosen wrong. The reality of her regret settled in as she saw me moving on, saw that I was finally finding some peace without her. Cheryl and I were building something real, something grounded and simple. My daughters were doing better, happier even, with Cheryl's warmth bringing a stability back into our lives. It was a fresh start, one that I hadn't even realized I needed until it was happening. Vera, though, was left on the outside looking in. From the rare conversations I had with her about the kids, I could sense a bitterness, a kind of quiet desperation that she tried to mask. She was watching from the sidelines as I rebuilt the life she'd torn apart. I imagined that for her, the hardest part wasn't just losing me but watching me find a happiness that had nothing to do with her anymore. Life with Cheryl felt like a new chapter, one that was completely different from anything I'd known with Vera. Where my past life had been full of complications, with Cheryl, things were simple, honest. There were no games, no hidden agendas, just two people learning to trust again, one day at a time. We didn't rush into anything serious. At first, Cheryl and I kept our relationship casual, wanting to be certain that we were both ready for this step. I was cautious, maybe even more than I realized, afraid of getting hurt again. But Cheryl understood that without me ever having to say it. She never pushed, never pressured me to be anything other than myself. Over time, what started as late-night talks over coffee, quiet dinners, and laughter about work turned into something deeper. It was like she could sense what I'd been through, understood the caution that came with a broken heart. She listened with a patience I'd never experienced, and slowly, the guarded feeling I'd kept wrapped around my chest started to lift. For my daughters, Cheryl was a breath of fresh air. She didn't try to take Vera's place, she just carved out her own role, as a friend, a mentor, someone they could trust. She'd spend time with them in ways that felt natural, taking them to the movies, helping with school projects, listening to their stories from school. She had this quiet way of making them feel seen, and as much as I'd wanted to protect them from another change in their lives, seeing them with Cheryl made me feel at ease. The girls warmed up to her fast, especially Lizzie. They'd laugh together, share little jokes, and I'd catch Lizzie glancing at Cheryl like she was her hero. And as a father, watching my daughters find joy again after everything we'd been through was everything I could have hoped for. One night, as we all sat together on the couch watching a movie, my eldest daughter Julia looked over at me and said, "Dad, I like her." It was so simple, but it hit me hard. I looked at Cheryl, who was completely focused on the movie, oblivious to the moment happening between me and my daughter. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were going to be okay. Slowly, Cheryl became part of our lives in a way that didn't feel forced or sudden. It was like she'd always been there, filling a space we didn't even realize was empty. The girls began to ask for her, and she'd drop by more often, cooking meals with us, helping around the house, making our family feel whole again. But as my life took on this new shape, I knew Vera was watching from a distance, stuck in her own choices, alone with the regret that was only just beginning to settle in. As I moved forward, Vera seemed to sink deeper into the consequences of what she'd done. She tried reaching out more often, leaving me voicemails filled with apologies, sometimes almost pleading, saying how much she wanted to talk to explain. But the time for explanations had passed. Through the grapevine, I heard about her life falling apart. She'd lost most of her friends, even some family members who'd been close to us both. Her parents were disappointed, embarrassed by her actions. They didn't cut her off, but it was clear their support was strained. When people looked at her now, they didn't see the woman they used to admire. They saw someone who'd thrown away a marriage and shattered a family. One day, I received a message from an old friend who'd stayed neutral through everything. He mentioned he'd seen Vera in town and that she looked rough. Said she barely looked like herself, tired, worn down. He asked me if I was sure about moving on, if I'd thought about giving her a chance to explain. I could tell he still had that, maybe it was just a mistake perspective. But he hadn't seen her with Clayton that night. He hadn't watched the life he built unravel in one split second. I kept my answer short. She made her choice. Even though I'd moved on, there was a part of me that felt the impact of her regret. Not that I wanted her back. No, that wasn't it at all. But I'd spent almost 2 decades with Vera. We'd built a life together, shared memories, raised our kids side by side. And seeing that life she was left with, knowing she was alone, didn't fill me with the satisfaction or closure you'd expect. It was just sad. But that sadness didn't make me waver. If anything, it reminded me that I'd made the right decision. Every time she tried to reach out, every time she tried to mend things, it only reminded me how badly she'd broken our family. And now, watching her struggle from afar, it was clear that her regret couldn't fix what was already lost. As the weeks turned into months, I didn't answer her messages, didn't respond to her attempts to reconnect. She was living with the weight of her own choices, facing the reality she'd created. I was focused on my new life, on Cheryl, on my girls, and on building a future that didn't include her. While Vera was grappling with her own regrets, my life with Cheryl continued to grow into something I hadn't believed was possible again. She brought a steady warmth into our lives, a stability that had been missing for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like. My daughters were happier, more relaxed, and it was clear they felt safe with her around. One weekend, Cheryl suggested a short road trip, just the 4 of us. It was her way of getting everyone out of town for a change, away from the weight of everything that had happened over the past year. She even went out of her way to plan activities that my daughters would love, little hikes, movie marathons at night, and even a surprise trip to a quirky art museum that Lizzie had been talking about. We loaded up the car, packed with snacks, board games, and enough music to last hours. The girls were laughing in the back seat, and Cheryl was at my side, her hand resting casually on my arm as I drove. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Not just okay, but genuinely happy. At one point during the trip, we stopped by a lake for a picnic. Julia, my oldest, was helping Cheryl unpack the food, laughing at some joke Cheryl had told. Watching them from a few feet away, I felt this sense of calm, a feeling that, against all odds, things were finally right. Cheryl wasn't trying to replace Vera. She was just being herself, a friend, someone my daughters could rely on. And somehow, without forcing it, she'd become part of us. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Cheryl and I sat on the deck of the small cabin we'd rented, looking out over the lake. The air was cool, and the stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. She looked at me, a hint of a smile on her face, and said, "I don't think I ever imagined being here like this. With you." Her words felt raw and honest, and I realized she'd been just as hesitant as I'd been, carrying her own doubts, her own fears of being hurt. But here we were, both of us letting go of the past, both of us starting fresh. I took her hand, feeling that steady warmth she'd brought into my life, and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you. You came into my life right when I needed someone who understood." She smiled, giving my hand a light squeeze. "And I don't know what I would have done without you either, Tony." In that moment, under the stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a deep, honest love. Not the kind built out of habit or history, but one that felt solid and real. This was something new, something earned through all the pain and struggle. I knew right then and there that this was the start of a new chapter, one I'd been waiting for without even realizing it. And this time, I wasn't letting go. Life was finally beginning to feel settled, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt a sense of security. But just as I was starting to feel like I'd truly moved on, Vera reached out one last time. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some work, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Vera. I hesitated, part of me wanting to ignore it, but something made me open it. Her message was simple, but the weight behind it was clear. "Can we talk? Please, just one time." I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. I'd ignored so many of her attempts to reach out, to explain, to apologize. I'd told myself time and again that nothing she said would change what she'd done. But maybe it was the finality of it all, or maybe I just needed to close the chapter once and for all. Whatever the reason, I agreed to meet her, suggesting a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, I spotted her immediately. She looked worn, tired, like she'd been carrying the weight of everything for months. Her once confident smile was gone, replaced by a nervous glance as she looked up and saw me. I took a seat across from her, keeping my expression neutral, waiting for her to speak. She took a shaky breath and finally started. "Tony, I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. I know that probably doesn't mean anything to you now, but I need you to know how much I regret what happened." I stayed silent, letting her continue, feeling a strange sense of detachment as I listened. "It was a terrible mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know why I did it. Maybe I was looking for something that I thought I'd lost in us, but I see now that it was all in my head. Everything we had, it was real. And I threw it all away for nothing." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. But instead of anger, all I felt was a quiet sadness. Not for what we'd lost, but for the person she'd become, the person she'd allowed herself to become. I didn't doubt her regret, not anymore. She was paying for her choices in a way I hadn't anticipated, her own guilt and isolation serving as a constant reminder of her mistakes. I finally spoke, keeping my tone calm and steady. "Vera, I appreciate you saying that. I do. But you have to understand, this isn't something that words can fix. We had years together, a life, a family. But the minute you chose him, you shattered all of that. There's no going back from that." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. I just wanted you to know. I wanted to say it out loud." We sat there in silence for a few moments, the reality of everything settling in between us. For her, this meeting was closure. For me, it was confirmation. I'd made the right choice. I'd moved on. And while she was left dealing with the weight of her decisions, I was free to finally live my life. When I stood up to leave, she reached out, her hand brushing mine. "Tony," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please just remember the good times." I looked down at her, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of sympathy. "I do remember them, Vera. But that's all they are now, memories." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her and everything we'd once been behind. And this time, I felt no hesitation. Only relief. Walking out of that coffee shop, I felt a weight lift. It was strange, really. I'd thought I'd already let go of everything to do with Vera, that I was past it all. But facing her, hearing her apology, and saying those final words out loud brought a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. It was like shutting a door I didn't realize was still open. Now, everything felt clean, final. In the days that followed, Vera's messages stopped completely. The calls, the attempts to reach out, the endless texts, they were gone. She must have finally understood that this was it, that there was no coming back. She tried to salvage something, to make me remember what we'd once had, but all that was left were memories, distant and faded. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was just done. And as for my life now, I could feel the difference in the air. I no longer had to brace myself for her attempts to make things right, no longer had to worry about reopening old wounds. Cheryl noticed it too. One night as we were sitting together, she looked at me, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "You seem lighter these days," she said, her voice warm, soft. I nodded, realizing she was right. "I think I am," I replied, feeling that simple truth settle over me. Feels like a chapter one can finally put behind me. Cheryl took my hand, lacing her fingers with mine. "I'm glad. You deserve that, Tony." Her words hit me, filling me with a warmth I hadn't known in years. Cheryl wasn't just a partner to fill a gap in my life. She was someone who saw me for who I was now, without the baggage, without the scars. She'd been patient through all of it, given me the time and space to heal, and for that, I was grateful in ways I couldn't put into words. That weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done since the separation. I took down the last of the old photos of Vera and me. The ones still tucked in the back of the photo albums. The ones I'd kept for the girls. I replaced them with new ones. Photos of our road trip with Cheryl, our family outings, moments that were fresh and filled with joy. It was a quiet ritual, one I hadn't planned but that felt right. When I finished, I sat down and looked at the small collection of memories we'd started to build together. I realized then that Cheryl and I weren't just filling the empty spaces left by the past. We were creating something new, something I hadn't even believed was possible. For the first time in years, my life was my own again, and I was ready to build it with someone who truly valued it. With Vera fully out of my life, the future with Cheryl felt solid, steady. My daughters were growing closer to her, and with each passing week, she became an essential part of our family. There was no pressure, no forced roles. Cheryl found her place naturally, and the girls warmed to her in ways I hadn't expected. They were happier, more open, like they felt a peace in the house that had been missing for too long. We started creating our own traditions, simple things that made the house feel alive again. Friday nights turned into movie marathons where each of us would pick a film and pile up on the couch with popcorn and snacks. Cheryl and the girls would sometimes bake together on Sunday afternoons, filling the house with the smell of cookies or brownies. It was the kind of life I'd always wanted, full of laughter and warmth, without any lingering shadows. One Saturday, Lizzie came home from a friend's birthday party with a huge smile. "Dad, they had a family game night. Can we do that too?" she asked, her eyes bright. I looked over at Cheryl, who gave me a nod and a grin. "Of course," I said. "Game night it is." So, Saturday game nights became a thing. We'd play board games, card games, even silly guessing games that had us all laughing until our sides hurt. I could see how much it meant to the girls, and how much Cheryl loved being a part of it. One night during game night, my eldest, Julia, surprised me. We were in the middle of a game when she put down her cards and looked at me, a serious expression on her face. "Dad, are you going to marry Cheryl?" The question caught me off guard. Cheryl glanced at me, a little shy but not uncomfortable. I took a moment, feeling the weight of what Julia had asked. I hadn't thought about marriage in years, hadn't let myself consider the possibility. But now, looking around at this life we were building, I realized that marriage with Cheryl wasn't just an idea, it was something I wanted. "I don't know," I said, smiling a bit. "But I wouldn't rule it out." Julia's face lit up, and Lizzie clapped, bouncing on the couch. Cheryl chuckled, a soft blush on her cheeks, and reached over to squeeze my hand. In that moment, I felt like I was finally exactly where I was supposed to be. After that night, the idea of marriage kept lingering in the back of my mind. Cheryl and I hadn't rushed things, but what we had felt natural, real, and strong. The girls had bonded with her, and the more time we spent together, the clearer it became. Cheryl wasn't just someone I was dating. She was family. A few weeks later, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I found myself watching her, noticing the way she joked with Lizzie about the dishes, the way she helped Julia with her homework. It struck me how much love she poured into everything she did, how much light she brought into our lives. I knew right then, I didn't want to go another day without her as a permanent part of our family. So, I started making plans. I wanted the proposal to be something small and intimate, something that involved the girls, something that would mean more than just the two of us. One Friday night, I gathered everyone in the living room, saying I had a special movie planned. Cheryl looked a little suspicious but sat down, her eyes bright with curiosity. Instead of a movie though, I put on a slideshow of photos from the past year. Pictures from our road trip, game nights, movie marathons, moments that showed just how much she'd become a part of us. The girls giggled and made comments as the pictures flashed by, but Cheryl was quiet, her eyes glued to the screen. At the end of the slideshow, I turned to her, my heart racing. I knelt down, took her hands, and looked up at her with every ounce of sincerity I had. "Cheryl," I started, my voice catching a bit. "You've been our light. You've filled this house with more love and laughter than I ever thought possible. You've become family to all of us, and I can't imagine a life without you. So, will you marry me?" The girls gasped, their eyes wide and excited, and Cheryl brought her hand to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. She nodded, laughing through her tears as she said, "Yes, Tony. Yes." Lizzie and Julia jumped up, hugging us both as Cheryl and I wrapped our arms around each other. In that moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. The pain of the past, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all faded into the background, replaced by a happiness so complete I could hardly believe it. That night, as we all sat together, laughing and sharing the moment, I realized I'd found everything I'd ever wanted. Cheryl was home, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a peace that went beyond words. We were a family. And this time, it was forever. After Cheryl said yes, life felt like a dream. It was the start of a new beginning that I hadn't let myself imagine before. Our days were filled with a sense of hope and joy, a feeling that everything we'd been through had finally brought us to exactly where we were supposed to be. The girls took to the idea of the wedding with enthusiasm I hadn't anticipated. Lizzie immediately declared herself in charge of picking out flowers, while Julia wanted to help plan the music. Every dinner turned into a family meeting, where they'd present new ideas and Cheryl would listen with a smile, always encouraging their ideas, even the more outlandish ones. One evening, Lizzie came up to me with a sketch of her dream wedding dress for Cheryl, which looked more like a fairy princess costume than a bridal gown, complete with wings. Cheryl and I laughed, but seeing Lizzie so excited about her future stepmom and the family we were building was a kind of happiness I hadn't known in years. Cheryl saw it too. She knelt down to Lizzie's level and told her, "You know, I think you have a great eye for this. Maybe you'll be a wedding planner someday." Lizzie beamed, and Julia added, "Maybe she can plan your second wedding, Dad, on your anniversary or something." The girls' innocence and optimism were contagious, and for the first time, I felt like they'd fully accepted Cheryl as part of us, not just someone new in our lives. As the months went by, our wedding plans came together in a way that felt more like a family project than anything else. We decided on something simple and intimate, with only close friends and family, a small gathering that would let us focus on the meaning behind it all instead of the event itself. The day of the wedding came quicker than I'd expected. We held the ceremony at a small garden not far from our home, where the flowers were in bloom and the air was filled with that quiet, peaceful feeling that made everything feel right. My daughter stood by my side, looking proud and happy, and when Cheryl walked down the aisle, I felt my heart swell in a way that words can't capture. She looked radiant, a soft smile on her face, her eyes shining with a happiness that matched mine. The girls held her bouquet and helped her with her dress, beaming like it was the best day of their lives. As I took her hands, standing there with my daughters at our sides, I knew this was the family I was always meant to have. When we said our vows, Cheryl spoke directly to my daughters, promising to be there for them, to love and support them, and to cherish the family we were creating together. I could see the emotion in the girls' eyes as they looked at her, understanding that she wasn't just marrying me, she was marrying all of us, building a home for us as a whole. In that moment, I realized that she wasn't just becoming my wife, she was becoming their mother in a way that went beyond titles or labels. The reception that followed was filled with laughter, music, and a warmth that felt like the very best parts of life. Our small group of friends and family toasted to new beginnings, and as the girls danced with Cheryl, I felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for this second chance, for Cheryl, for my daughters, and for the new life we were building. I'd come through the darkest parts of betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, and had found something so much better on the other side. Near the end of the evening, Julia pulled me aside, her face serious for a moment. "Dad," she said, "are you happy?" I smiled, hugging her tightly. "More than I can say, sweetheart." She looked over at Cheryl, who was talking to Lizzie, laughing at some joke only the two of them understood. "I'm glad," Julia said softly, looking back at me. "I like seeing you like this. We all do." As the night wound down, I took a moment to step back, just watching Cheryl, my daughters, and the friends who had become like family. I realized that this was a new beginning, but also a continuation of all the good things that had come before. This was the life I'd always hoped for, but now it was even better, stronger, because of everything we'd been through to get here. That night, as Cheryl and I tucked the girls into bed in our new home, I whispered a quiet promise to myself, to protect this family, to love them fiercely, and to never take a single moment for granted. Cheryl smiled at me as we closed the girls' bedroom door, and in that look, I knew she felt the same. We'd made it through. We were together. And now, we had a future filled with love, laughter, and all the new traditions we would create together. This was our family, our life, our forever. And I was finally at peace.